Chapter 2 Pink Martini Traders. Hungry. Wyan was very hungry. Her stomach twisted in angry knots as she drove down the streets of Naples, bathing in the mild summer heat. Though her focus should have been directed to getting back to the city prison for the second time that day, her stomach had other plans, encouraging her eyes to scan the array of buildings for some kind of fast food joint. A single slice of buttered bread had not been a suitable choice of breakfast at 3 o'clock in the morning, and skipping out on her lunch left a rather unpleasant feeling in Wyan's midsection, though, with how her day had been going so far, she had no time for food. Working in the mafia took a bite out of her regular eating habits. The 3 weeks that Wyan had worked for Leaky Eye Luca were nothing compared to the hustle and bustle she had experienced with delivering Polpo's message to the bodyguard squad. Wyan had previously been tasked with meeting strange men in alleyways and dark street corners where she would ramble off a list of names or numbers and then be on her way. No eye contact, no questions asked. She was an outsider, after all, so she avoided any business that wasn't her own. And to their credit, the low-end members of the notorious gang, Passione, were as cautious as Wyan was. There was never a need to question or be questioned, but when one of Passione's incarcerated capos asked Wyan to take part in the real mafia business for the first and final time, she had not expected an immediate interrogation at a restaurant full of young, oddly dressed men. In all honesty, Wyan wasn't sure what to expect when she arrived at Lebecchio's, the restaurant where Bucciarati and his team regularly ate. A group of older men smelling thickly of overused cologne and preoccupied with an array of strippers was a more anticipated outcome for the afternoon. But instead, upon her arrival, Wyan was met with a group of teenage boys shoveling cake into their mouths, led by another, more charming teenage boy. And what surprised her the most was the interest she took in the message she had to deliver. Never had Wyan been so curious about a report. The regular messages she delivered were a series of random names and strange numbers, leaving no room for imagination or any sort of creative flair. But this message had been scripted poetically, leaving Wyan wondering what it meant. And clearly, what she had relayed to Bucciarati and his team was urgent. The second he heard Polpo's message, Bucciarati immediately gathered his men and went out to deal with the problem. No wonder the bodyguard squad was so highly respected by the capo. Those men meant business. Passing through brightly lit streets and maneuvering her car around hordes of jubilant pedestrians, Wyan decided that she would go to Polpo before getting herself something to eat. She would tell him that his message was delivered successfully, and then could she treat herself to a dinner out in the city. Her mouth began to water at the thought of eating an extra-large helping of linguine allo scoglio at one of the many infamous seaside restaurants that Naples had to offer. But before she could do any more daydreaming about food and fancy beverages, Wyan had to go to the city prison. Parking in front of the same vacant building she had just hours before brought on a rather odd thought. Luca, who had treated her shamelessly those past 3 weeks and even just that morning, had gone out of his way to call Bucciarati and inform him of her loyalty to Passione. Luca's change in behavior had been evident in the prison when confronted by Polpo, but had his mood toward Wyan continued to improve? Was she going to finally be given the respect she deserved? Wyan sent searching fingers into the glove compartment, attempting to locate her phone. The cool touch of metal grazed her palm, and with practiced movements, she flipped the phone open and sprang to dial Luca's number. The receiver buzzed twice before Wyan was met with her boss's familiar, angry voice. "Speak," is all he said. "Oh, I was just calling to say thank you, for thinking ahead and calling Mr. Bucciarati," Wyan stammered. "I think what you want to say is, thank you for correcting my stupidity, Luca," Luca said. It was a fool's mistake to head into the mouth of a beast without any form of protection, and that is exactly what Wyan did when she headed into Lebecchio's without any solid proof of her loyalty to Passione. For all Bucciarati knew, Wyan was some sort of undercover cop, handing out falsehoods that would lead his team to the pit of a prison cell. Yeah, I apologize," Wyan said. She took a breath and unbuckled her seatbelt, but as she stood out of her car, Luca's voice filled her ear like cold running water, harsh and with no remorse. Of course you apologize. That's all you ever do. Listen here, girl. The only reason I called Bucciarati was to cover my own behind. I think we both know that if you failed to deliver that message, both you and I would be missing our heads thanks to that big ol' capo polpo. Her steps did not falter as Luca spoke, and when he finally stopped insulting her, Wyan had nothing else to say. So, as she continued walking down the street towards the sunlit city prison, her breath and a phone call full of silence was the only thing to accompany her. It was until she rounded the street corner and faced a line of beautiful buildings, all abandoned and creeping vines, that Luca began to speak again. His voice remained solid, but his words were somehow softer. Listen, Wyan, drop my number, 'kay? Remember what Polpo said this morning? You're no longer under my watch. Bye until I see you next time. With a click and a buzz, the phone call had ended. With several swipes of her nimble fingers, Luca's number had been blocked and deleted. On such a hot summer day, Wyan couldn't help but wonder why the city prison had to be so damp. Everything from the stone walls to the plush carpet seemed to drip with water. It was like she was a rabbit trying to escape the sun's burning rays and ended up wandering into the damp den of some large beast. But to the little rabbit's surprise, the beast welcomed her into his home. The beast even went as far to ask for her aid. The officers that lounged at the building's entrance didn't question why Wyan had returned to the prison for a second time that day. Instead, they preoccupied themselves with childish banter and a broken air conditioner. 3 officers stood over a hunk of metal in the front of the foyer, attempting to get the fan to start running. But arguing ensued, and Wyan knew that the AC would not be fixed any time soon. Her shoes sloshed as she walked towards the short female officer who quietly apologized for the damp carpets. Lazily, a metal detector was swung up and down the sides of Wyan's frame before she was let through the security gate. Polpo says it's urgent. You should get a move on, the female guard said. It took Wyan a moment to realize that the young lady officer had been talking to her. Turning back to face the woman, Wyan nodded in thanks and hustled down the building's long hallway, not daring to ask where she heard that information from. Sweat dripped down Wyan's forehead and her chest as she crept deeper and deeper into the beast's den. Without any cool air, she had to wonder how the prisoners were surviving in such heat, or if there were any other prisoners than the capo at all, because from what she'd seen so far, not a single soul occupied the building aside from Polpo and the police. After almost getting lost twice, Wyan walked on to meet the fogged glass of the capo's prison cell, and being a beast as large as he was, it was hard for Wyan to lose sight of him. Polpo was sitting up, with loose papers in his thick hands and a slice of pizza dangling from his mouth. A fan buzzed in the corner of his chamber, but was all too small to cool off his massive frame. He didn't notice her approach, so Wyan cautiously knocked twice on the cell's broad window, gaining his attention immediately. Knock, knock. Wyan had expected Polpo to grin or to flare his brows at her, the same look that cats would shoot towards meek little mice, but instead she was met with an eagerness that the capo could not hide. He wasted no time with petty games and got straight to the point. Take this, he said, slipping one of his many documents through the food slot. Memorize it and deliver the message to the bodyguard squad right away. Polpo went back to scanning the pages in his hands as Wyan took the slip of paper and read it to herself. The pink martini traders, with their vicious fangs, will use their venom on the golden zipper, is what was scribbled on the sheet. And even further down from the scratchy handwriting was an address. Suddenly clouded with questions, Wyan looked up at the capo in hopes that he could read the look on her face and answer at least one of her many questions. Would this address lead her to the bodyguard squad? What is the pink martini? Fangs? Venom? Golden zippers? Was delivering another message not going against Polpo's own words? Her brows furrowed deeply as she peered up at the big man. One small glance to his left, towards the small rabbit, and Polpo let out a thick sigh. He did not enjoy having his time wasted, it seemed. The address will lead you to Bucciarati. You need to go now. This is a very urgent matter, he said. Polpo shuffled in his seat, trying to find a comfortable position while YN scanned the page several times over to memorize the message before her. When her recitation of the message could be conducted fluidly, she placed the paper back into the empty food slot and tilted her head to meet the capo's gaze. Sweat covered his round face and dripped from the tip of his slender nose. His black eyes were wide, and a look of concern crossed his features as the little rabbit peered up at the big old beast. Go. You need to get the message to the bodyguard squad, or death will meet my most trusted men. Another poetic beauty had its grips on YN. The message, of course, left her confused and greedy for more. She wanted more knowledge. She wanted to know every last detail of what these simple yet elegant words could mean. To her, they meant only curiosity, but to the bodyguard squad, they probably meant the world and more. YN took off in a sprint down the prison's slender hallway. Water splashed up her back as she kicked her heels faster and faster. The wetness of the carpet and the heat of the building did not make her falter as she quickly climbed toward the front foyer. Well, that was a quick visit, the young lady officer said, amusement tugging at the corners of her round lips. Yeah, it was, YN huffed and puffed, still catching her breath. I knew a little thing like you couldn't stand to be in the same vicinity as that brute of a man. The cop laughed to herself, but YN remained quiet. Did the officer think she was running away out of fear? Better that than the cop finding out she was working for the brute behind bars. The woman flicked the metal detector up and down YN's body before allowing her to leave. As casually as she could, the messenger jogged past the 3 other officers on duty, tending to the still broken AC unit. They didn't notice or bother looking back as she made her way outside. The sliding doors shuddered as they spread open, and YN moved into the sunlight. She parked 3 streets away from the city prison, just as Luca had instructed her to do so midnight and that morning. But regret blossomed in her chest as she ran towards the vehicle. She should have parked closer to the city prison. The mere minutes it took for YN to make it back to her car could be the minutes needed to deliver Polpo's message to the bodyguard squad, and the thought of missing her opportunity by a few seconds made her stomach twist in angry knots. Running breathlessly, YN had to sidestep around hordes of sightseers and street vendors. If she weren't in a hurry, she would have joined the crowd and enjoyed a long walk through the stunning city of Naples. But with a message that she couldn't fully decipher and a capo urging her to pass on the report as quickly as possible, YN couldn't waste her time gaping at the city's inner beauties. The minutes blew by as YN drove faster and faster. A salty ocean tang filled her car as YN turned down the street Via Romana. Elder trees had parted to make room for the cobblestone roadway that stretched hundreds of meters ahead of her, and tall trimmed bushes guarded each of the buildings that sat neatly on the street. From her car window, she couldn't make out any of the estates hidden behind the green shrubbery, but long, stony driveways had split the bushes into 2, allowing for guests to enter and leave as they pleased. Her gray model of the 1999 Fiat felt rather out of place as she drove past luxurious cars and received stares from strangers all down the street, but too consumed by the beauty of the roadway to notice any of their wandering glares, YN drove onwards in search for her final destination, building number 503. At the furthest end of the Via Romana street sat a rectangular building enclosed not only by shrubbery but also guarded by a large ornate gate. Her eyes had been drawn to a stone slab that sat on the foot of the venue's driveway, reading 503 Via Romana. She had arrived. Luckily, the gate sat wide open, so she stepped hard on the gas and sped into the venue. The long driveway was lined with small trees, pointing YN in the direction of her destination, number 503. Red stone walls shone brightly against the deep blue of the horizon. The sea moved stoically from behind, and seabirds clouded the bright sky from above. A fountain sat methodically in front of the venue's entrance, and 2 women dressed in all black stood tall at the foot of the building's long veranda. Pulling her car to a stop, Wyan took notice of one of the women, a tall blonde with particularly sharp features, moving towards her car. She quickly hopped out of the vehicle and faced the woman. "Oh, hello. I'm just running to meet my friend. I'll be leaving momentarily," Wyan stammered, in hopes of understanding, but the tall woman only smiled, held out her hand, and ignored her awkward interaction. "Of course, miss. I'm a valet here. I will take your car to our private lot so that other patrons may come and go without having to drive around your vehicle." Looking back at her Fiat, Wyan observed that the small car did in fact take up a rather significant amount of space on the slim driveway. Tossing the valet her keys, she waved a quick thanks and ran towards the building's brass doors. The second valet, a dark-skinned woman with a head wrapped in locks of deep brown, held open the door for Wyan and smiled gracefully. "Welcome to the Pink Martini," the woman said. Stopping in her tracks, Wyan swung her head to face the valet in shock. The Pink Martini in Polpo's message was not a drink or a person, but was a place? How could she not have realized this? Tearing her stare away from the woman, Wyan moved forwards, and upon entering the building, her ears were met with the soft chatter of patrons and a breezy tune of jazz. She was in a lounge, a jazz bar with drinks, elegantly dressed women, and high-class men. The soft, warm lighting of the Pink Martini was so inviting, and the smell of pizza, bruschetta, and ricotta with roasted tomatoes practically pulled Wyan into the lounge. But after taking a single step into the Pink Martini, a pair of hefty men in dark suits stood in her path. Excuse me, miss, but we are going to have to ask your name and who invited you before we can let you in," the taller man said. Wyan immediately broke out into a nervous sweat. She didn't have time to chat with security, and she didn't know if telling them that she was delivering a message for a mafioso would be all that good of an idea. Instead, she ignored their presence and searched the bar. She stood on the tips of her toes to try and see over the security guards, attempting to locate anyone of familiarity, anyone who could get her closer to delivering the message to Bucciarati and his team. A flash of purple and white caught her wandering eye. It was him, the biggest of the bodyguard squad, lounging at a table with a tall glass full of deep red liquid. He wasn't hard to miss. His long lilac hair stood out in the dark crowd. He sat lazily with his legs spread and his broad back pressed against the end of the chair. Wyan raised her hand, swinging it in the air, trying to catch the man's attention, but with most of his back pointed toward her, he was unable to see her feeble attempts at recognition. Miss, please stop waving your arm around. If you could just tell us your name and who invited you, we can allow you entry, but until then, you can't step any further." This time, the bald security guard spoke, and though he sounded fairly polite, Wyan was in a crunch for time, so all of the friendliness left her voice as she spoke her next words. "Move! I need to find a man named Bucciarati," she shouted. Pushing past the guards, it was then that Wyan noticed the rest of the bodyguard squad sitting at the table with the lilac-haired man. One of them, a boy with strawberry blonde hair and deep purple eyes, caught a glimpse of Wyan with the two security guards. He nudged the others and pointed in her direction, encouraging their gaze to meet her own. Seeing this as her only opportunity to deliver Polpo's message, Wyan took off in a sprint towards Bucciarati's team, who sat in the very back of the lounge closest to the live band that had been playing So What by Miles Davis. All 5 of the men at the table stood quickly as Wyan ran towards them. Security was close behind as Wyan yelled, "I have an urgent message!" She drew all eyes within the Pink Martini to herself. She rounded the table towards Bucciarati and leaned as close as she could to him before the security guards could grab her. "The Pink Martini traders, with their vicious fangs, will use their venom on the golden zipper," is what she whispered in his ear. Just as firm hands wrapped around her midsection, Bucciarati spoke. "Gentlemen, please excuse the eagerness of my companion. She sits with us." It only took a moment before all eyes seemed to turn elsewhere, occupying intimate conversations and pointed away from Wyan and the bodyguard squad. With solemn nods, the 2 burly men turned away and walked toward the front of the lounge, but not before insisting that Bucciarati could call them if Wyan continued to cause any more trouble. "Repeat the message," the strawberry blonde said as soon as the security guards turned to leave. And when she did, the boy was fast to lean across the table and remove Bucciarati's drink from his hand, placing it on a passing waiter's tray and giving out the orders to have it sent back to the kitchen. Wyan recognized him from a few hours before. He had not spoken to her upon her arrival, but nonetheless she took full notice of his hole-filled lime-green suit that he adorned in Lepecchio's. But now, in the pink martini, the boy was clad in dark shades of forest green, with plush turtleneck sweater and long dress pants. The drastic change in his rather revealing style made Wyan wonder how hot he was in his outfit. He glanced at her once and sat back down without another word. Dressed in black and gold, the leader of the bodyguard squad stood beside Wyan as he scanned the lounge, eyes sharp and chin down. The man looked like a predator on the hunt for his nimble prey. Just like with the strawberry blonde, this man's suit was different from the one Wyan had seen earlier that afternoon. The darkness of his attire made his warm skin glow softly, but what remained unchanged were the golden zippers that sat neatly all over Bucciarati's suit. Golden zipper. It had clicked, a moment of realization causing Wyan's eyes to beam out of both awe and fear. Bucciarati was the golden zipper in the message, and someone in the pink martini was trying to assassinate him. This explained why the strawberry blonde was so quick to remove his drink. He was being cautious of any poison. The rest of the bodyguard squad took their seats, except for one, a boy with deeply tanned skin and a navy blue suit. Wyan recognized that this was the boy who had cake smeared on his face only a few hours ago, looking rather classy at the moment. He continued to scan the bar, just as Bucciarati had done, but this boy had his hand on his belt. No, he had his hand on a gun. The pistol sat loosely by his belt buckle, tucked neatly into his pants. It was only when Bucciarati told him to take a seat that he cautiously lowered himself into the chair and readjusted the rather strange hat that sat on his head. "Lady, are you going to be our new messenger or something? Because if you are, you got to learn how to act appropriately in public. Second time in one day that Bucciarati has had to save your behind." It was the smallest who spoke, his eyes pointed directly at Wyan. He wore a purple dress suit and a black button-down vest. Everything about him was tidy except for his hair, which sat in loose tangles with small sprockets poking out from every direction of his head. I apologize for my rudeness, and no, sir, I'm only here temporarily." Wyan tipped her head down in embarrassment, but an eruption of laughter broke out from the raven-haired boy, causing her to glance back up at him. "Sir? Really? If you didn't know my name, you could have just asked. Don't call me sir. I'm not 80. His giggles were airy and light with life. Naranja, Wyan observed, was a walking beam of sunshine. "Naranja, she's only being polite. Enough fooling around. We have work to do." Bucciarati let out a sigh as Naranja attempted to quiet himself, but only continued to laugh. Turning to fully face Wyan, Bucciarati spoke. "Thank you for the message. You are dismissed." An exasperated sigh came from the opposite end of the table, and Wyan found herself staring down at the lilac-haired man, Abbacchio. His presence was all but known to Wyan until he wordlessly grabbed her attention with a huff of air. With his head tipped back, Abbacchio's eyes became lost in the shadows of the lounge. All that she could make out was his sharp jaw and plump lips painted in a deep shade of purple to match his dark fabric suit. His jacket hung limply on the back of his chair, leaving him dressed in a button-down shirt that had barely been done up and a pair of slim dress pants. Only the bottom 3 buttons of his shirt were clasped, revealing the smooth planes of his toned chest. Wyan looked at him, and she supposed he looked back, but she really couldn't tell because he had hidden his eyes so well in the darkness. She furrowed her brows, confused as to how such a high-class bar would let someone so casually expose himself. Abbacchio must have read the look on her face, because he leaned forward into the light, forearms resting on the table. With eyes as sharp as daggers, it took little effort to pierce Wyan's stare. "Do you have a problem?" He spoke, and it was barely a whisper, but it was enough to make her turn her head and look towards the door without mumbling another word. She didn't want to waste time chatting with this brute. A crash of glass sounded as slick wetness coated Wyan's front. Looking down, she saw the mess of drinks a waiter had managed to spill all over her, and in that same moment she noticed the casual clothes she wore while walking around in such a classy establishment. When she'd looked away from Abacchio, she'd walked into a waiter. Embarrassed. She was totally embarrassed by the clothes she was clad in and the dampness that was quickly seeping through her shirt and shorts. And for some reason, she was embarrassed most of all for the men who sat directly behind where she stood and who had the pleasure of witnessing the whole thing. She walked directly into a waiter. In such a rush, YN had made an absolute fool of herself. Even the music stopped as eyes shot out from every direction once again to point at her. "Ma'am, you should watch where you're The waiter spoke, but stopped before he could finish. Seemingly interrupted by nothing but silence, YN decided she should just apologize and leave as quickly as possible. But as she opened her mouth to speak, glancing up at the man, not a single word left her lips as she stared right back into the waiter's eyes. It was him, wearing all black, like the rest of the staff, with his dark hair tied back into a limp ponytail and slender glasses sitting on the edge of his short nose. Galstov stared at YN just as intensely as she stared back at him, and the lounge was quiet. From the moment her eyes met his own, YN knew that the treacherous viper from Polpo's message stood mere feet in front of her. It was too convenient for a lowlife working under Leaky Eye Luca to somehow manage a position at the Pink Martini, one of the classiest bars in all of Naples. YN's brows turned down in anger, and Galstov seemed to take notice of this, notice of her sudden realization. In a flash, the viper dropped the tray with the remaining drinks that stood, and pulled a small gun from his apron. Screams erupted from all ends of the Pink Martini as Galstov lifted his arm and pointed the barrel of his pistol directly at Bucciarati. A sudden solidness had found itself on YN's lower back, and with a single, swift push of his foot, Abacchio sent the messenger onto the floor, rolling and far away from the gun. Gunshots sounded as she lay on the smooth wood, hands covering her head and knees pressed tightly to her chest. A yelp sounded from a few feet in front of her, and the heavy footsteps of civilians followed as staff and patrons alike fled the Pink Martini. A repulsing sob filled her ears as Galstov begged for mercy. She didn't know to whom he begged, or how he managed to be the one injured, but as she tilted her head up from the floor and its hiding position, her eyes saw Narancia and the strawberry blonde carrying Galstov into the men's restroom and far, far away from where the gangsters once sat. She didn't want to think what the mafioso would do to him, though they were teenagers. YN had to remind herself how much looks could deceive and brought her focus back to the floor beneath her, trying to rid her mind of any disturbing thoughts. A pair of large hands made their way onto YN's shoulders as she was hauled off the floor. The grip on her frame was tight, and she was practically being lifted as the figure behind her moved to sit YN upwards and then to plop her into a vacant chair at the gangster's table. "Are you trying to screw us over? Or are you just an idiot?" Abacchio, who had placed YN in her seat, was now gripping the back of the chair, leaning in close to her face to get all of the answers out of her. She couldn't look away, and she definitely couldn't get up. She was trapped under the man's big frame. His shirt hung loosely as he leaned forward in front of her, and though she was tempted to peek down at his bare, toned chest, YN knew that the mafioso would send her flying through a wall if he caught her checking him up and down. "Abacchio, come on. The lady didn't mean any harm," the gunslinger said, his hands on Abacchio's shoulders trying to pry him from the chair. But Abacchio's gaze did not falter when he spoke, staring deeply into YN as he said, "I don't care if it was an accident or not. We were supposed to carry out the mission discreetly. We just let at least 50 people know that we're mafioso. We were supposed to get that Galstov Bruta without anyone knowing, but now we're all stuck like sitting geese in the Pink Martini with a single treacherous viper and one dumb idiot who can't look where she's going when she walks." A sigh escaped Bucciarati, who stood to Abacchio's right. "Yes, I'm quite disappointed that such a large disturbance was caused, but there is nothing we can do now. We have one of the traitors, and we're going to get the answers we need. Abacchio, give YN some space." One of them. The words rattled in her head as she realized her mistake. Wyan's eyes widened in horror. Abbacchio didn't move. His lips curled in disgust. That's right, idiot. If you hadn't made such a scene, we would have been able to get answers from Galstav without scaring away any of the other traitors. Your stupidity continues to amaze me, he said. Recalling the message from Polpo, Wyan remembered that the word vipers and traitors had been plural. More than one renegade walked within the pink martini. If she had simply been more cautious, as she turned around, she probably wouldn't have knocked into Galstav, which caused the series of unfortunate events to ensue. That's an order, Abbacchio. Go take a walk, Bucciarati said sternly. With a click of his tongue, the man straightened and walked toward the men's room. Screams erupted from the directions of where Narancia and his strawberry blonde friend were currently holding Galstav, but Abbacchio's sauntering did not falter. Narancia jogged from the men's room and past Abbacchio, who continued in the general direction before disappearing behind the swinging door. Narancia grinned as he spoke to his boss, clearly eager to share the information had been received. So Butt Munch in the bathroom had quite some good stuff hidden under that thick tongue of his, Narancia said. Go on? Bucciarati's attention was fully focused on the boy, and so was Wyan's as she remained seated in the leather chair. But the gunslinger, on the other hand, had sauntered his way to one of the many vacant tables and began snacking on a slice of untouched pizza. The stupid messenger lady over here was right. He pointed in Wyan's direction, and a hurt look spread across her face, but he didn't seem to notice. That chum in the bathroom really was trying to kill you, but he insists that the gun was his last resort. Apparently, he was originally going to poison your wine, Narancia said. A vision flashed of the strawberry blonde removing Bucciarati's glass of wine from his hand. The boy knew that poison was a likely possibility and was quick on his feet. Why did he choose to station himself at the pink martini? Bucciarati rubbed a thumb over his lip as he questioned the small interrogator. All he's doing is shaking his head whenever Fugo and I ask. We've tried to inflict pain, but all he does is scream. No words, Narancia said. Interesting, Bucciarati mused. Go get the others. We all need to talk, including the messenger. He glanced down at Wyan, who remained seated. His facial features remained ambiguous. She couldn't read his expression. Narancia took off toward the bathroom, leaving Bucciarati and Wyan by themselves, with the gunslinger wandering toward an empty kitchen in search for more food. I will say, without your message, I probably would have been killed by the poison, or paralyzed to say the least. So, thank you, Wyan, Bucciarati said. Don't grow fond of that thing, Bucciarati. She's only temporary. Abbacchio had managed to soundlessly make his way to the boss and the messenger. And it wasn't his quiet footsteps that caused her mouth to fall open in offense, but the fact that he called her a thing. With some mustered courage, Wyan stood, pointing her body toward Abbacchio's. For a man as big as you sure do whine a lot, she spat. Laughter burst from Bucciarati, but Abbacchio was not amused. Little girls like you shouldn't be getting their hands in dirty mafioso business, and maybe, if your brain was as sharp as your tongue, you might be useful around here. It's a shame you're too dense, Abbacchio said. His smile grew, wicked and tight with pleasure, but the gunslinger, with a cup of wine in one hand and his gun in the other, and a piece of salami dangling from his mouth, seemingly appearing from nowhere, stood in between Wyan and Abbacchio. Break it up. All of this bickering is killing my appetite, and quite frankly, I'd like to eat in peace, he said. Mista, finish the food you stole and round up the others. Narancia is taking too long, and we have some important things to go over, Bucciarati ordered. You got it, boss. Handing a plate of potato focaccia rolls to Wyan, Mista said, Finish those bad boys off for me, will ya? Before jogging towards the men's room. She didn't even see him pick up the plate, but didn't hesitate to indulge in the deliciousness that had been gifted to her by the strange boy. With her mouth full, Wyan turned to see Abbacchio staring at her in disgust. You have no class, was all he said before taking a seat furthest away from where she was. One by one the boys exited the bathroom, but one mafioso in particular had hurried his way towards Bucciarati. What is it? Fugo?" Bucciarati questioned. The strawberry blonde held up a phone. "I found this on Gustav, with a list of contacts. He's still tied up in the bathroom stall, and he isn't wearing his shirt or pants, so if you go in there, prepare yourself, because he's clothed in nothing but neon yellow undergarments and is drenched in sweat." A burst of laughter erupted from Narancia, who stood close behind Fugo. The raven-haired boy looked up at his boss with tears of amusement in his eyes. "He kept refusing to speak, so we brought the knives out. We had to show him how sharp they were, so we cut away all of his expensive clothes. You should have seen the look on his face, Bucciarati. It got even better once we began using the blades on him." More laughter ensued before the boss held up his hand to quiet the giddy boys. "That's actually what we must discuss. Usually, with interrogations," Bucciarati said, "it takes Narancia alone all of 5 minutes to get the information out of the sorry man he's interrogating. But our small friend Gustav appears to be rather difficult." The gunslinger stepped forward. "We need to get the names of the other traitors of Passione. We can't just let them go all high and dry. So what's the plan?" Mista asked while his hands worked on splitting a piece of pancetta in half. Narancia stood quietly beside the gunslinger with his palm held open, clearly awaiting a piece. "Good question, Mista. Though I do think our messenger friend here can help us with that," Bucciarati said, causing all eyes to turn toward YN. She was the bodyguard squad's temporary messenger, and now she would become their temporary interrogator.